There's currently no one here. I'm going to wait. I'm expecting it to be a decent amount. I'm going to wait until people show up. Test 1, 2, 3. Oops, that's a lot of static. That again. Oops, that's a lot of static. That again. That should have fixed it, right? I think that fixed it. It was sticking out a tiny bit. Sorry about that. Let's try. Yep, okay. So now the audio seems okay. All right. All right, well, I guess no reason to postpone. People will watch this after it's done and hopefully they'll join in. Hopefully people will join in and we'll just see what happens. So yeah, there you go, live. All right, so my plan is the following. I'm gonna just plug away. I'm gonna read the preface, chapter 1, and then if there's time, I'm gonna go on to chapter 5 and 7 and 8. And may continue until next week. May continue into next week's show. And then after, so I'm not going to do more than that because I feel like that would be pushing, what's appropriate. And then after that, I'm going to read Stephanie Bell's paper on taxes don't fund federal spending, federal taxes don't fund federal spending, and that currency, all federal spending is done through created currency. So her 1998 paper. After that, I'm going to read what you suggested, Aaron, which is the shorter federal job guarantee 8-page paper by Matt Forstead, forgive me, I'm mixing up the names. Tell me the name, please. Matt. The name skips my mind at the moment. So I'm going to read the 8-page paper on the federal job guarantee, and then after that, I'm going to start to get your input. I definitely want to go towards Pavlina Cherneva's working paper from April of this year, Matthew Forstater. Yes, so his 8-page paper, that's a short one that definitely we can do in 2 hours, and we can hopefully even talk about it. And after that, I have like a whole bunch of ideas I really like this idea of just reading things, because my life is such that I really just don't have time outside of this to do research and create stories like I wanted to. I have a story that I think is decent. The content of the story I think is good, but framing it into a story, into basically a mini presentation, is just way too much work given what my life is like now. So I like this idea of reading things. So if you have suggestions of what you want read, and I think important papers, economic papers, and old books, meaning like Karl Marx or whatever it is, that are that are no longer copyrighted, so that there is no copyright issue of reading them. I really like the idea of reading important papers, so that as I read it, I learn, we learn together, and when there's time, we can stop and talk about it. And I am hoping to make this potentially into, it's just a dream right now, but I'm hopefully making this, reading these things into a podcast. So Stephanie Kelton's paper will just be a podcast episode of just reading that paper straight through. And I think that would be valuable. It certainly would be valuable for me. And I think it is less likely to be a problem as far as copyright is concerned. Reading Stephen Hale's book all the way straight through, I think, would be a copyright violation. But reading a portion, a segment, is not necessarily a problem. So, all right, so let's get started. I'm not so sure I'm going to be able to see too many comments as I'm reading. What I think I'm going to do is read for a good, 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then maybe spend the last 5 to 10 minutes, if there's a decent amount of comments, to talk about what was just read. Otherwise, I'm just planning on just plugging through. All right, so just show you the cover. Can you see this? Backwards mirror image, of course, but Stephen Hale's book, Economics for a Sustainable Prosperity, published by the Benzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. I might as well read this little one-page sort of blurb by the publisher, which is the Benzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Actually, before I get started, I'd be grateful if you guys shared this around, so people will join in. Oops, let me pull this out. Okay, from the publisher. Sustainable prosperity is a holistic notion encompassing the physical, mental, environmental, financial, educational, and civic well-being of all individuals, families, neighborhoods, and regions throughout the world. In this sense, sustainable prosperity requires the development of a multifaceted public policy framework addressing the root causes of global, national, and regional socioeconomic challenges. It must guarantee all individuals a decent quality of life with dignity and the opportunity to be a member of an inclusive, participatory, and just society. Sustainable prosperity means that every decision we make, individually or collectively, must take into account its direct and indirect effects on people, on the planet, and on the economy. Crafting solutions to the complex challenges that confront us in the 21st century requires an interdisciplinary approach at the intersection of economics, ecology, and ethics. The Binzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity book series seeks proposals from a broad range of fields that encompass and further this philosophy. We welcome authored works or edited manuscripts that investigate socioeconomic inequality based on class, race, ethnicity, and or gender, and that promote policies to further sustainable prosperity among marginalized groups. We especially encourage proposals that build on the job guarantee approach to full employment, financial sovereignty, functional finance, renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, environmental policies, local community development, local capacity building, social ecology, social venture partnerships, and social entrepreneurship. This was published in 2018. Preface, page V through VI. This book has been written largely in response to comments made by Fidel Kaboub, the president of the Binzager Institute for Sustainable Development and associate professor of economics at Denison University, on a doctoral thesis I submitted in 2016. He wrote that he would recommend me publishing the dissertation as a book, but would also encourage the publication of a non-technical version of this work to invite non-academic audiences into these very important public policy discussions. After all, public policy in a democratic society ought to be truly participatory in nature, but when the public lacks the ability of understanding the basic implications of alternative economic policy proposals, and also lacks the ability of challenging so-called experts, then we end up with people submitting to policies that actually work against their own interest and increase inequality and socioeconomic exclusion. Close quote. I set out to do as he recommended. However, I have not removed every equation and chart from the book, since to do so would have blunted its effectiveness in advocating for the replacement of a neoclassical orthodoxy, which has been used so successfully in support of a neoliberal agenda in recent decades, with a new economics for sustainable prosperity, which can be used in support of a genuinely progressive and inclusive agenda for the future. Instead, I have kept them to a minimum, explaining their significance along the way and occasionally inviting those readers not wanting to bother with algebra to take the results for granted and move on. At the heart of this new economics is modern monetary theory. What is this? Oh, I see. Squeezing the... Okay. At the heart of this new economics is modern monetary theory. In February 2018, I saw a podcast of a brilliant interview conducted by Steve Grumbine of Real Progressives with two of the founders of modern monetary theory, Professor Stephanie Kelton and Professor William Mitchell. Kelton and Mitchell separately made the point that, without an understanding of modern monetary theory, there can be no successful prosecution of a genuinely progressive agenda in the USA or elsewhere, and that the achievement of equitable and sustainable prosperity in the future depends on widespread understanding of the principles of modern monetary policy among the voting public. As Professor Joan Robinson said long ago, people need to learn some economics to avoid being fooled by economists. It is my hope that people will choose to read this book and that it will help equip them with enough understanding of both the old economics and the new so that they are not fooled, but instead are empowered by what they have learned. My thanks go to Philip Lawn, a colleague and mentor over many years at both the University of Adelaide and Flinders University, I have also benefited greatly from regular discussions with Colin Rogers at the University of Adelaide, with Anna Mihailov now at Kaplan, Australia, and in recent times with the prize-winning journalist Claire Connolly. Occasional opportunities down the years to talk with and to be inspired by Geoffrey Harcourt have also been a treasure. I wish I could thank an unknown banker who, in spite of his seniority at work, was a student on a course I was teaching in London, leading to the membership examinations of the Chartered Institute of Bankers at some point during the late 1990s. He approached me at the end of an intensive course and, with reference to the orthodox description of monetary policy, said, "You know it couldn't really work that way, don't you?" 20 years later, I now know very well that it doesn't work that way. This book is an attempt to share with you some of what I have learned. My greatest debts will always be to my father and late mother, Tom and Trudy, and to my wife, Catherine, for their unfailing love and support. Stephen Hale, Adelaide, Australia. All right, so chapter 1, pages 1 through 20. I'll say the page number every now and then for people just catching up. I'm looking at the electronic version, PDF. Chapter 1, Introduction, Searching for a New Economics. I arrived as a student at the London School of Economics nearly 4 decades ago, full of enthusiasm and idealism, wanting to learn how to make the world a better place. I had already done advanced level economics at school and read a little bit of Keynes without properly understanding what I was reading. I believed in 1981, as he had written in 1935, that quote, the outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and incomes, close quote. This seemed obvious, and under the prime ministership of Margaret Thatcher, it was only getting worse. I had at least taken in Keynes's statement made in the final sentence of the general theory that, quote, soon or late it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. Although this is in part because I have always had a tendency to read the final sentence in a book before reading what goes before it. Like many of my contemporaries, I wanted to learn about how the world worked. I wanted a set of ideas which would help to bring about a better society. What I got, from lecturers who were, in many cases, among the leading economists of the day, was training in pure mathematics, and particularly in the fruit of the rational expectations revolution in macroeconomics of the previous decade. By the time I left university, I knew a great deal about the work of Robert Lucas, whose name will crop up in chapter 2 of this book, and of his colleagues. I knew they had built on earlier work by Milton Friedman. I was vaguely aware of a debate between Friedman's monetarists and James Tobin and his fellow Keynesians, which it seemed the monetarists had won. I was thoroughly taken in by the notion that macroeconomics had progressed to be a genuine science, that my job was to learn to use the tools of this science, that no serious alternative existed, and that Keynes, and anyone who had ever worked with him, was out of date. Keynes had been dead for more than 30 years, and economics had moved on. In the apparently triumphant words of the economist David Laidler, 1981, quote, "We are all monetarists now." Note 1. David Laidler has for many years been one of the leading monetarist economists. His words echoed the statement, quote, "We are all Keynesians now," which have been attributed somewhat misleadingly to both Milton Friedman and Richard Nixon. All right, continuing. Like many of my generation and of the next, I had been sold a pup. Macroeconomics had not moved forwards, and the whole discipline of economics was not progressing. It was regressing. It was already in a muddle, and sadly since then the muddle has only got worse. I did not learn what I had expected to learn in my naivete. I learned an economics which normally serves powerful vested interests, albeit often without economists being aware this was the case. It is an economics resting on a set of assumptions which,
though demonstrably invalid, were convenient both for the development of particular types of mathematical models and as a justification for the neoliberal transformation which followed, not only in the USA and the UK, but across most of the world. I was never exposed to the work of post-Keynesians like Mikhail Kalecki, Joan Robinson, Nicholas Kaldor, Abba Lerner, Hyman Minsky, Paul Davidson, or Wynne Godley. I never did understand Keynes, or at least not until many years later. We did not so much as mention the ecological limits to growth, as discussed in the Club of Rome report, Meadows et al., 1972. There was nothing from the then newly emerging literature of behavioral economics. We certainly did not discuss Karl Marx. This is not to say that there were no electives available, where Marx might at least have got a look in. However, by the time you had taken your macro, micro, and econometrics subjects, in my master's degree there was no room for more than one elective. I chose development economics and swallowed even more neoclassical dogma as a result. By then, I had been so badly misled that I would have objected to anything else. It took me many years before I understood that I had been misled. I began to develop an interest in behavioral economics after the 1987 stock market crash, which undermined my faith in the previously all-conquering efficient markets view of financial markets. Over time, during a career spent training accountants and bankers, I met the odd banker who suggested to me that the orthodox description of monetary policy could not possibly be correct, and gradually the significance of this began to sink in. Financial crises seemed to be happening more and more frequently. Inequality kept rising in many countries, and trickle-down economics began to seem absurd. Then, in 2002, I started teaching at the University of Adelaide, which at the time, in Colin Rogers, had a head of school who was a prominent post-Keynesian. I barely knew such economists existed. I read some of Colin's work, for example, Rogers' 1989, which led me on to that of Jeffrey Harcourt 2001 for a good start, the most famous economist ever to work at the university, and to what was for the first time a correct understanding of Keynes. Forgive me for the religious reference, but I felt like a born-again economist. This was what I had wanted to know in 1981 and had lacked both the maturity to discover for myself and the encouragement to do so from those who had been my educators. There was still something missing, though. The general equilibrium approach of orthodox economics, which I will reject in Chapter 2, for very good reasons, at least seems to hang together. It is suggestive of the approach to economic management which the great majority of economists, politicians, and pundits continue to take for granted to this day. Post-Keynesian economics seem to me to lack the internal consistency and power to ever challenge orthodox economics with much prospect of success. To change the direction of our societies from a path of neoliberalism towards one of equitable and sustainable prosperity, something was missing. That something was modern monetary theory. I was originally introduced to modern monetary theory by Philip Long, who was Australia's leading ecological economist and a pioneer of a metric of economic development called the Genuine Progress Indicator. Phil was a colleague of mine at Flinders University in the middle of the last decade, and persuaded me to start reading Bill Mitchell's Billy blog. William Mitchell from the Centre of Full Employment and Equity in Newcastle, New South Wales, is not only one of the principal developers of modern monetary theory, but is also a candidate for the title of the world's best living economist. However, despite reading his blog, I remained something of an MMT skeptic until the collapse of Lehman Brothers on the 15th of September in 2008. It was that event and the events that followed it which led me to read voraciously all the modern monetary theory I could lay my hands on, as well as books and papers by Hyman Minsky and Paul Davidson, and by Mikhail Kalecki and Keynes himself. As you can see, I am a slow learner. It took years for me to think about and understand the main elements of an economics for sustainable prosperity. Modern monetary theory is central to such an economics. It is, in my opinion, a genuinely beautiful set of ideas, concepts, and principles, elegant in its simplicity, powerful in its validity, profound in its significance, revolutionary in its implications, and, for many people, transformational in its impact on their thinking. For me, it lies at the center of a broader set of ideas, arguments, and discoveries drawn from a variety of disciplines and perspectives, which hold out the hope that we can harness this interconnected knowledge to deliver a future economy characterized by sustainable prosperity. We can do much better in the future than we have ever done in the past. All right, so that's the end of the section, page 4. Page 4, next section. Escaping from the old ideas. More and more people are learning about modern monetary theory, asking questions about it, discussing it with others, using it to distinguish truth from fallacy in a variety of economic debates, and applying it to make sense of the appropriate role for governments to play in pursuit of genuinely sustainable and equitable prosperity. It is close to a tipping point. Hold on a moment. It is close to a tipping point, beyond which it will become impossible to ignore. There is a great deal of momentum behind it. This is just as well as the dominant orthodox wing of the economics profession stands in the way. The barriers to fundamental change in the economics profession are very high. Heterodox economists have been trying to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy for many years, with little practical success, even when the evidence has been clearly in their favor. They have often been sidelined and ignored. It seems then that a large part of the impetus for any such change has to come from outside the economics profession, so that the mass of the profession is eventually forced to wake up and think again about much that has long been taken for granted. This book is meant to be a small push in the direction of change. While I hope it is a good read for economists, of both the heterodox and the more open-minded orthodox varieties, it is intended just as much for activists and policymakers with an interest in economics. I hope for some people it will be a shortcut. I would not like you to have to go through such a long process of transition as I have done. I hope it is accessible to all, useful to many, and I hope it doesn't make economics seem like brain damage. That is exactly how economics was described by the environmental activist David Suzuki in a 2011 documentary movie. Note 2. This Canadian movie was called Surviving Progress. End note. Economics, however, is obviously just the study of the economy. The economy is the set of natural and fabricated resources, institutional arrangements, organizations, and markets which are available to meet our needs and to influence our current and future well-being. It is something which we have created and which we can and will change for better or for worse. Like all institutions, it evolves over time, and not necessarily in ways which are conducive to genuine progress. It has evolved and been managed in such a way as to push us beyond our planet's ecological frontier, while at the same time in many countries failing to provide the social foundations for shared prosperity. You could say the same thing about economics as a discipline. It has evolved in a way which has not been conducive to the well-being of people and the planet. To state that millions have been lifted out of extreme poverty is not much of a defense for economic orthodoxy. Many millions still live in want and insecurity in a struggle for survival, in a global economy with the technology to make this unnecessary. And all the while we are using, according to the global footprint network, such a high level of ecological resources that we would need 1.7 planet Earths for this to be sustainable in the long term. If every individual on the planet consumes resources at the rate of the average American or Australian, we would need 5 planet Earths. We have, since the 1970s, unnecessarily gone well beyond our planetary boundary for resource use, partly because orthodox economics has encouraged our leaders to concentrate on goals which are largely irrelevant to human welfare, and to ignore those things which really matter. Even in America and Australia, relative poverty has increased, as inequality has been allowed to rise to levels not seen since before World War II. Many of the changes which have happened in the USA and elsewhere over the past 30 years have been destructive rather than progressive, and for that, the economics profession shares a great deal of the blame. So it is understandable that a lot of people have lost faith in economics and might echo Suzuki's words. Much of the economics done over a long period has been, if not brain damage, at least a form of brainwashing, and this is true of virtually all the work done within orthodox macroeconomics since about 1980. The good news is that this brainwashing is not irreversible. If you have had too great an exposure to it, and feel yourself to have been damaged as a result, then this book is offered as a remedy. If you have so far avoided being damaged, then please see this book as a form of inoculation. Once you have read it, you will be able, if you wish, to read a wide variety of mainstream texts, or to engage prominent conservative economists in debate with no fear of being misled. Instead, you will be amazed that they could have been so wrong about so much that matters over such a prolonged period. You will wonder how this is even possible. To describe all economics as brain damage, though, is silly and potentially self-defeating, whatever your form of activism. To quote John Maynard Keynes, once again from the last page of the General Theory, quote, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, and are more powerful than is commonly understood. Now, as much as at any time in history, it is important for as many people as possible to engage with economic ideas, and to identify which seem to be right and which are wrong. At the very least, we can then, as Joan Robinson put it, quote, avoid being deceived by economists. By the wrong sort of economists in any case, because the right sort of economics can be a force for good and help to deliver a genuinely sustainable prosperity." In his brilliant popular science book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, 2003, Bill Bryson described the reluctance of leading geologists over many years to accept or even to take seriously the notion that the continents are not fixed in place, but drift and collide over time. It took more than 50 years for plate tectonics to be accepted as valid, despite the fact that generations of children had by then noticed that the continents in places seemed as if they would fit together like pieces in a jigsaw, and that there was overwhelming scientific evidence of continental drift. For half a century, plate tectonics was not something in which a respectable geoscientist could believe. It is not only in economics that the great majority of the supposed experts in a field can be badly wrong about fundamental issues over a long period. Imagine that the economics well-being of billions of people had relied on the theory that the continents are fixed in place. The consequences could have been disastrous. They might have included growing inequality and insecurities in many countries, long-term unemployment and underemployment, rising household indebtedness, financial fragility, and dangerous climate change. All this may have gone along with growing political unrest, terrorism, the rise of the alt-right, and public disillusionment with mainstream politicians and their advisors. David Suzuki might have described the work of these scientists as brain damage. He would, of course, have been wrong to describe the whole of geoscience in those terms. It will be obvious once you have read this book that, for many years, the majority of economists have doggedly maintained and built upon a core model of the economy, which has been no more reliable than the theory that the continents are fixed in place, but far more difficult to displace and with precisely the consequences described above. So dominant is this orthodoxy that David Suzuki might imagine it to be the only approach to the study of the economy in existence. Fortunately, It isn't. There is a better alternative. My purpose is to identify and explain the main elements of a new approach to economics, which will help us to achieve sustainable prosperity, allowing, quote, all individuals a decent quality of life with dignity and the opportunity to be a member of an inclusive, participatory, and just society, close quote. Note 3. This is the definition of sustainable prosperity suggested by the editors of the series of this book on behalf of the Binzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Continuing. This approach has different roots, different characteristics, and suggests radically different policy options to the economics which has dominated global discourse in recent history. Inequality, insecurity, poverty, unemployment, financial instability, and ecological crisis have multiple causes, but an important contributory factor to them all and to the social problems which are derived from them has been the discipline of economics as practiced by the great majority of the profession in recent decades. Economics can be a force for good or ill, but has too often in the past been the latter, acting as a barrier to genuine and widespread progress. This book is a search for an economics which will contribute towards, rather than frustrate, sustainable prosperity, and so be a force for good. End section. So this is page 7. Next section, page 7, 2 traditions. Let us begin with a distinction between two very broadly defined approaches to doing economics. We might regard them as traditions. They are so broadly defined that it has been possible for the entire economic debate that many outside the profession, including David Suzuki, and even some within it, have ever been exposed to fall entirely within the first of them. According to the first of these traditions, the economy revolves around and is controlled by you and people like you. What is produced is what you want to consume. It is produced before being traded into markets using your labor, and using capital goods or machines. Natural resources, including energy, are either ignored or treated as a form of capital good. There is very little discussion of ecological sustainability. Growth is good. It means there are more goods and services for you to consume. It is assumed that you choose how much to spend and save out of your current income or how much to borrow based on your well-established preferences and well-informed foresight as to your future needs, opportunities, and risks. You are free to choose. Note 4. Free to Choose was the title of a very influential book and television series by Milton and Rose Friedman, published in 1980. Continuing. You are free to choose how much of your time you use for leisure, how much time to spend in paid employment, again based on your preferences. The amount you earn depends entirely on how productive you are and on the number of hours you choose to work. You love to consume, but you hate to work. If you are unemployed at least for longer than the time it takes for the economy to recover from occasional random shocks, this is your choice. There are a few frictions and so-called externalities, including pollution and the emission of greenhouse gases, disturbing what would otherwise be a perfectly efficient economy. But otherwise, a free and competitive market economy provides the best of all possible worlds. Note 7. At least it leads to an outcome which is Pareto efficient. This means a situation where it would be impossible to make one person better off without making at least one other person worse off. Back to note 5. Frictions. Frictions is a term used by orthodox economists to refer to anything they believe might prevent the economy from reaching an ideal allocation of resources and full employment. For example, Milton Friedman saw a legal minimum wage as a friction. Note 6. Externalities. Externalities are costs and benefits due to economic activity falling on third parties. So, for example, if Sam produces a good, Jane consumes it, and Jean is harmed in some way by the process, perhaps due to the emission of a pollutant, then there is an externality, a negative one in this case. Continuing. Provides the best, a free and competitive market economy provides the best of all possible worlds given the behavior of people like you. If there are things about the world you don't like, that is the fault of people like you. You have all the power. There isn't very much that governments need to do. According to the second tradition, if you are a typical worker, people like you have very little control over the way the economy works. Entrepreneurs and corporations might hire you if they are confident that they will be able to make enough profit from doing so to make it worth their while. Those entrepreneurs and corporations are operating in an uncertain economic environment. The amount you earn is largely dependent on the bargaining power you possess, rather than on any measure of productivity. Whether you have a job and how secure that job appears to be is something over which you probably have no direct control. What is available for you to buy in the shops is what those corporations think they can persuade you to buy. The pursuit of a standard of living comparable to those around you, and you do tend to compare yourself with people living around you, can lead you into debt. Involuntary unemployment can have severe and long-lasting psychological effects. The economy can be a very unequal place. Growth has benefits, but it also has costs, and it is potentially unsustainable if it pushes economic activity beyond our planetary ecological boundary. Governments have a responsibility to keep the economy close to full employment, to limit inequalities of income and wealth, to ensure everyone can meet their basic needs without being forced into debt or exploited, to maintain the natural environment for current and future generations, and to work towards some form of sustainable prosperity. It is the first of these traditions which has up to now been dominant. It is often labeled as mainstream, orthodox, or neoclassical economists. If you have been an economics student at any point since about 1980, then unless you are very lucky, virtually everything you were exposed to in what passed for your education came from within this tradition. It includes what many people call Keynesian economics, though not, as we shall see, the economics of Keynes, as well as including monetarism. Note 8. What most people think of as Keynesian economics is what will be described as neo-Keynesian economics in Chapter 2. Keynes was not a neo-Keynesian. The economics of Keynes will be discussed in Chapter 3. Continuing. It includes neo-Keynesians, new Keynesians, new monetarists, and real business cycle theorists. It includes those who have advised Republican presidents and those who have advised Democrats. They are all from the same tradition and have far more in common than what divides them, at least insofar as their views on the correct way of doing economics are concerned. At least on average over time, they all agree the economy will be close to its full employment level of activity. They all believe governments should balance their budgets in the long run. Note 9. There is among orthodox economists a divide between deficit hawks who believe governments should always avoid deficits, at least outside wartime, and deficit doves, who believe governments should run deficits during and immediately after recessions, but balance their budgets across economic cycles. Our economics for sustainable prosperity will lead us to reject both these views of fiscal policy. We will be deficit owls. Continuing. They generally think that if you are low on income, while this is unfortunate, it is a reflection of your low productivity, and the only solutions are to train you to a higher level or to find ways to motivate you to be more productive. If you have a low wage or are unemployed, it is a problem with you. The economy revolves around you. It must be your fault. In Chapter 2, for reasons which will be explained there, this dominant tradition will be labeled real analysis despite the lack of realism. For the moment, I will call it soft economics. Note 10. The distinction between economic theories is W. Glimcher's Foundations of a Neuroeconomic Analysis, 2011. Play no role in our foundations of an economics for sustainable prosperity. Those who practice soft economics, however, remain at the helm of central banks and finance departments worldwide. Their grip on power is perhaps very slightly looser than it was before 2009, but they still dominate the overwhelming majority of university economics departments, control leading academic journals to the exclusion of work produced by those from outside their tradition, and act as gatekeepers to careers in economics within major policy institutions. They normally hire people just like themselves, and so are self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing. They are usually defensive of their tradition and dismissive of those working outside their tradition. But there is another tradition, and there have always been some economists working wholly or largely within the other tradition. It goes by the name of heterodox economics and includes people who call themselves post-Keynesians and a variety of others who fall outside what remains at the moment of the orthodox approach to doing economics. In chapters 2 and 3, we will give it the label of monetary analysis, but for the moment it can be called hard economics. Sustainable prosperity will be built on hard foundations and not on soft ones, with a recent contribution to hard economics known as modern monetary theory playing a central role in the new economics for sustainable prosperity, for which we are searching. In Chapter 3, we will see that Keynes is a central figure within this tradition, and that those who call them New Keynesians have little or nothing in common with the economics in Keynes. End of the section. This is page 10. So we're halfway through the chapter. Please consider sharing this around so people can start getting on board and we can start developing this. Next section, page 10. Soft and hard economics. The words soft and hard in this context have nothing to do with how difficult the approaches are to learn and to apply, or how harsh the policies advocated by Can you hear my kids? Or how harsh the policies advocated by economists from within each tradition might be. Instead, the words refer to the realism or lack of it, of the assumptions on which economic theories and models are built. Their use in this context is drawn from a recent book on neuroeconomics, Glimcher 2011. In soft economics, realism is ignored, and the only concerns of model builders are whether the predictions of their models appear to them and their colleagues to have value, and the conformity of their methods with the currently dominant view of the correct way of economics. If the techniques are standard and the predictions are seen as useful, the realism of the assumptions used to build the model is of no consequence. The soft tradition lends itself to mathematical theorizing, and so attracts to the profession people who are easily impressed by mathematics and less interested in realism. In turn, this biases the profession towards a model of the economy which tends to be supportive of a laissez-faire approach to economic management, Those doing soft economics typically deny that ideology has any role to play in their theorizing, seeing themselves as objective scientists. But they abuse the scientific method, albeit unintentionally, and are wrong to argue that economics can ever be a values-free discipline. Those doing hard economics, how and why real people behave the way they do, and how economic institutions and processes actually work and evolve over hard because economics. It is not just about making predictions, but about building a useful map to guide policymakers through a complex economic landscape. Those doing hard economics make regular use of insights from a wide variety of other disciplines within the other social sciences and outside them. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, law, and even neuroscience are among those disciplines which are potentially important to hard economics. Conversely, soft economics is, quote, as if economics, where a set of often wildly unrealistic assumptions are accepted, and it is then standard practice to explore mathematically how the world would work if those assumptions applied, and to imagine that such predictions have relevance to a world where those assumptions clearly do not apply. Nobel Prize-winning economists from within this tradition, and the great majority of Nobel Prize-winning economists come from within this tradition, have dismissed disciplines like neuroscience and issues like the limitations of a decision maker with a human brain might face as being irrelevant to an economist. Note 11. As in the case for mindless economics, Gull and Pessendorfer, 2008. Continuing. At best, there is a grudging acceptance that other disciplines might sometimes have relevance to economics. There is a grudging acceptance that other disciplines might sometimes have relevance to economics, but not where they contradict axioms economists hold dear. There have been some changes for the better, but not so as to fundamentally threaten the way macroeconomics is done. I want us to go on a journey from the economy we have today to an economy of sustainable prosperity. Economic models and theories which are fit for purpose should provide us with a map to help guide us to our destination. Useful maps are not completely realistic reproductions of the regions they are supposed to represent. In a similar way, economic models can never include every detail of what influences human behavior or the structure of the economy and its institutions, All models and all maps must be, quote, wrong, in the sense that they are not identical to that which is being modeled or mapped. Note 12. The statement that, quote, all models are wrong is usually attributed to the statistician George Box, 1976. However, he also asked, quote, how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? That is the question. Continuing. Those who practice soft economics take comfort in this fact and sometimes claim on this basis that a search for realism is misplaced. Advocates of hard economics can only agree that models require simplifying assumptions to be of any use. However, as my former head of school Colin Rogers says, if you are trying to find your way across New Zealand, what you want to guide you is a simplified representation of New Zealand and not a map of Tolkien's Middle-earth. Note 13. Colin Rogers' so far unpublished paper, The State of Macroeconomics, a Post-Mortem, written in 2017, uses this Tolkien-inspired analogy. Continuing. Where did I? Yeah. Don't expect to find your way across New Zealand using a map of Middle-earth. Don't expect to anticipate a global financial crisis and a great recession, or to plot the best path out of that recession. or to plot the best path out of that recession, or to achieve sustainable prosperity using soft economics. In other words, for a model to be useful, it must share at least some of the characteristics of what it is supposed to represent. In a hard economic model, any assumptions you make must be justified. They may be assumptions which could be relaxed without changing the predictions of the model. They may be assumptions which specify the precise circumstances under which the model is useful to policymakers. Or they may be assumptions which exclude factors playing no significant role in the process the model describes. If they are none of these things, you are not doing hard economics. Note 14. The 3 valid justifications for incorporating assumptions in economic models are listed in Steve Keen's Debunking Economics, 2001. Continuing. It comes as a surprise to a lot of people that there are these 2 very different approaches to the study of how economics works. The study of how economies work, what drives their evolution over time, and what role, if any, government policies can play in ensuring economic outcomes serve the public purpose. It should be a greater surprise that the dominant tradition is that of soft economics, for no better reason than it is more susceptible to mathematical theorizing and to ideological bias. Soft economics, as it is taught in the majority of universities around the world and practiced in governments, central banks and international agencies. Soft economics, as it is taught in the majority of universities around the world and practiced in governments, central banks, and international agencies, limits the range of economic policy proposals which can be given serious consideration, and consequently biases policy outcomes. Paul Samuelson was one of the founders of modern-day soft economics, as well as the author of the best-selling economics textbook In the History of the Discipline, and the intellectual father or grandfather of almost all the texts used in universities and colleges around the world subsequently. He said, quote, "I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treatises, if I can write its economics textbooks." Note 15. This is according to Samuelson's obituary in the New York Times. Hyman Minsky, continuing. Minsky, who made major contributions to hard economics, once wrote that the game of policymaking is rigged. The theory used quote, "The game of policymaking is rigged. The theory used determines the questions that are asked and the options that are presented. The prince is constrained by the theory of his intellectuals." Note 16. Stabilizing an Unstable Economy by Minsky in 1986. Don't need that note. Oops. Okay. Continuing. The options that are presented to the prince are almost always exclude policies which would contribute to sustainable prosperity because of the soft economics being used. The game is rigged, and it has been rigged for a long time. Ronald Coase, like Samuelson, a Nobel Prize winner, said that the, quote, "knowledge will only come if economics can be reoriented to the study of man, and he is the economic system as it actually exists." Note 17. He said this very late in life in an article entitled "Saving Economics for the Economists," which appeared in the December 2012 issue of the Harvard Business Review. He also said in the same article that, quote, the degree to which economics is isolated from the ordinary business of life is extraordinary and unfortunate," close quote. If only he had not waited until he was over 100 years old to say such things. Soft economics is neither the study of people as they are, nor of the economic system as it actually exists. It is for the most part fake knowledge. The increasing softness of macroeconomics over the past 40 years has been a collective intellectual failure with profound consequences. This is why we need to search for a modern version of hard economics to replace the modern day orthodox macroeconomics, which is still today being used to rig the game. Economics as a profession really does need to undergo a revolutionary change, and the evidence of this need is not hard to find. It lies in the multitude of false and misleading statements of advisors and policymakers in all major economies in recent years, and also in the acquiescence and often endorsement of neoliberal ideology by orthodox economists. The recent record of soft economics, and especially soft macroeconomics, is so poor and its implications so misleading that it is hard to know where to begin. But given its disastrous last decade, the central bank of the Eurozone is as good a place as any. In 2010, the then chairman of the European Central Bank, along with a number of leading American and European economists, claimed that austerity could not cause a recession, and that a fiscal stimulus could not bring about an economic recovery in an economy with high unemployment. This was classic soft economics, in that there is no credible evidence for either statement, and they are both based on a logical outcome within a model based on completely unrealistic axioms. In other words, these statements are nonsensical, and yet these were the words of Jean-Claude Trichet, quote, "The idea that austerity measures could trigger stagnation is incorrect." Subsequently, the European economy as a whole stagnated for years, and in those countries forced into the most severe forms of austerity, as a condition for remaining in the Eurozone, there was worse than stagnation. Even the International Monetary Fund has now accepted that, when used, fiscal policy has in recent years been shown to be more powerful than it had expected. There was an entirely unnecessary depression in the Eurozone, from which Greece in particular may never properly recover. The scars are permanent. The USA, unlike Greece or Spain or Italy or France, is a monetary sovereign. Its currency issuing government can never be forced into insolvency. Nevertheless, the most recent Federal Reserve Chair, Janet Yellen, has said that the government's debt, quote, should keep people awake at night. Note 20. This was in her testimony before Congress on the 29th of November in 2017. Continuing. Only if they are badly misinformed should they lose any sleep. The scale of the government's debt, which can equally well be seen as a safe financial asset for the private sector and the rest of the world, will never lead to a financial crisis. Soft economics misleads you into the trap of seeing the government as facing essentially the same financial constraints as a household. If it misleads the chairman of the Federal Reserve, it is no wonder hardly anyone understands the vital difference between being a currency issuer and a currency user. The Congressional Budget Office, which is full of orthodox economists, uses phrases such as the challenges posed by the amount of federal debt held by the public, as if the savings of the public in US dollars are a challenge rather than a good thing, and in 2016 published, quote, 115 options for reducing the deficit. The office did not describe these options as, quote, 115 115 options for reducing the private sector surplus, even though that is what they are. The government's deficit, like its debt, has nothing in common with the debt of a household and cannot be interpreted to be good or bad, taken out of context. However, governments normally run deficits. Without them, everyone else cannot run surpluses. Looked at in this way, the aim of a monetary sovereign government should be to run as large a deficit as is consistent with non-inflationary full employment. This is a notion that many a modern orthodox economist finds as easy to accept as a 1950s geoscientist confronted with the statement that the continents never exist. Yet it is the truth. There are many other examples we could list, such as the complacent words of Robert Lucas that, quote, the central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes. Oliver Blanchard's ill-timed statement that, quote, the state of macro is good, or Ben Bernanke's description of the U.S. economy not long before the crash of 2008 as a result of, quote, a great moderation, oblivious of a gathering financial storm. Note 24. This was in a speech delivered at the meetings of the Eastern Economic Association in Washington, D.C. on the 20th of February in 2004. Continuing. So now we are on page 14, and that's the end of the section. This chapter goes up to page 20. Okay. Rescuing, next section, page 14, rescuing macroeconomics. Something is up with economics, and especially macroeconomics, as it has long been taught and practiced within the dominant tradition. As Paul Krugman said in his New York Times blog, in response to Blanchard, quote, the state of macro, in short, is not good. William Buter wrote in the Financial Times soon after the crash of, quote, the unfortunate uselessness of most state-of-the-art academic monetary economics, close quote. He went so far as to argue that most PhD level economic education over the previous 30 years had served to weaken the discipline rather than strengthen it. Paul de Grau, in the same publication a few months later, opines that, quote, the science of macroeconomics is in deep trouble. Charles Goodhart, at roughly the same time, accused Orthodox economists of, quote, a steadfast refusal to face facts, while writing of, quote, the continuing muddles of monetary theory. These are not obvious revolutionaries. There are few more eminent economists than Krugman, Goodhart, de Grau, and Buter. And with the exception of Charles Goodhart, they are commenting on a tradition of which they are themselves, in some ways, still prominent members. A dramatic shockwave was created by Paul Romer until recently, the chief economist at the World Bank and for some years a strong candidate for the Nobel Prize, in his paper, The Trouble with Macroeconomics, Romer 2016. He argued that the state of the art of orthodox macroeconomics had not progressed as a science over the past 40 years, but rather become more obscure, cloaked in mathematical symbols, and descended into something like alchemy or mysticism. Note 29. This was delivered by Paul Romer on the 5th of January in 2016 as the Commons Memorial Lecture of the Omicron Delta Epsilon Society, forthcoming in The American Economist. Continuing. This is the economics which still guides policymakers worldwide. It is based on a mistaken philosophical approach to doing economics. It is not fit for purpose in the 21st century. We need to replace it. The great majority of this book is forward-looking and positive. It is not a long discussion of the limitations and failures of orthodox or mainstream or neoclassical economics. The focus is on the construction of something more useful to put in its place. The building work has already largely been done. It is just a matter of selecting the most useful elements and bringing them all together in a narrative, which is what I have tried to do. However, we need to understand what it is we are seeking to replace, why it has been so persistent in spite of its deficiencies, and why it is so important that it is replaced. This is the business of Chapter 2. It is something which we need to attend to before we start on our path towards a modern monetary theory for sustainable prosperity. If we do not get our economics right, we will not achieve sustainable prosperity. Getting the economics right means doing the hard monetary economics, not soft economics. While there were contributions to hard economics before the 1930s by people like Thorsten Veblen and, in some respects, Karl Marx, the first serious attempts at the hard economics of monetary analysis was the work of John Maynard Keynes, particularly his General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and his later writing. We will begin putting together a hard economics for a sustainable prosperity in Chapter 3 with a discussion of what we can take from Keynes and from his colleagues, their students, and others who developed post-Keynesian economics in the years following his death. Note 30. Veblen was the founder of the Institutional Economics, the author of The Theory of the Leisure Class in 1899, and coiner of the term conspicuous consumption. He's also the author of the brilliant paper, Why is Economics Not an Evolutionary Science?, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1898, among much else. Veblen did hard economics. Note 31. It is obvious that Karl Marx cannot be summed up in a footnote. However, it is in terms of his influence on monetary circuit theory, which is related to and consistent with the modern monetary theory approach to economics described in Chapter 5, and on Kalecki's theory of income distribution, which will be discussed in Chapter 3, that Marx is important to an economics for sustainable prosperity. Okay. Continuing. A central concern of this book is a discussion and evaluation of modern monetary theory and its role, alongside insights derived from modern behavioral economics in building a future offering everyone, quote, a decent quality of life with dignity and the opportunity to be a member of an inclusive, participatory, and just society. Chapter 4 provides our behavioral foundations, drawing on the work of modern behavioral economists and contrasting this field with the inadequate psychological foundations of orthodox neoclassical economics. Chapter 5 is an explanation and discussion of the axioms of modern monetary theory, of the institutional realism of these laws and axioms, and of their implications for economic management. Chapter 6 provides a workhorse analytical macroeconomic model, within which the principles of modern monetary theory can be demonstrated, and which, it is argued, should replace the orthodox models currently being employed by most central bankers and treasury economists. Chapter 7 is a discussion of job guarantee schemes and of their significance to modern monetary theory, and to the construction of an economy offering everyone an opportunity of an independent and secure life with a good standard of living while ensuring we respect our ecological constraints. Some of the essential elements of an economics of sustainable prosperity are reviewed in my final chapter. A broadly defined behavioral and ecological form of modern monetary theory will allow us, and even encourage us, to introduce the policies we need and to make the necessary institutional changes to provide everyone with an opportunity of living a full and engaged life within an equitable and inclusive community while defending and maintaining natural ecosystems so that today's prosperity does not threaten the well-being of future generations. All this is possible. The future does not have to be a rerun of the past. And orthodox macroeconomics, which has been going backwards for more than 3 decades, is ripe for replacement. The economic policies which that failed macroeconomics have supported, which that failed macroeconomics has supported, have undermined both social stability and ecological sustainability. We can and must replace orthodox macroeconomics, just as we can and must reverse many of these economic policies. We can, you can, play a part in building a future of sustainable prosperity. It is up to us. I hope you enjoy this book. End of the chapter. Ooh, okay. There are no comments, so I'm just going to take a minute break and I'm going to go right on to chapter 5. Let's see where that is. All right, I will be honest and say that I have read chapter 1. I have not read chapter 5, so do the best I can, but take a minute break. I'm going to grab more water. I will be right back. Excuse me. All right, let's read chapter 5. Okay, chapter 5. This is page 141, and it goes through 182. Chapter 5, Modern Monetary Theory, page 141. Modern monetary theory, as a frame for thinking about macroeconomic policy, is central to the new economics of sustainable prosperity. Though there is much in modern monetary theory that is new, it nonetheless has long historical roots in their tradition of hard monetary analysis. For a macroeconomics text which is firmly grounded in modern monetary theory, see Mitchell et al., 2016. For a primer in modern monetary theory, see Ray 2012, Ray, W-R-A-Y, Randall Ray. For a less formal explanation, see Mosler 2010. I believe that that's the 7 deadly innocent frauds of something. It was developed in the 1990s by Warren Mosler, William Mitchell, and Randall Ray. By Warren Mosler, William Mitchell, Randall Ray, Stephanie Kelton, and others. It builds on the work of earlier post-Keynesian economists, including Keynes himself, on the contributions of Paul Davidson, Hyman Minsky, and Mikhail Kalecki, and on Abba Lerner's Laws of Functional Finance. It is also related to and can be supported with reference to the stock flow consistent monetary macroeconomics of Wynne Godley, which will be discussed in Chapter 6. It is grounded in a realistic understanding of the mechanics of monetary systems, of the possible configurations of monetary institutions in a modern economy, and of the actual day-to-day operations of governments, central banks, and private financial institutions under current institutional arrangements. It is directly related to the state and chartal theories of money of George Friedrich Knapp and Alfred Mitchell Innes. It is consistent with the available anthropological and archaeological evidence relating to the fundamental nature of money and its emergence in ancient societies. Note 3, quote, "Our knowledge of the monetary systems in primitive and early societies is necessarily somewhat sketchy. Nevertheless, I believe that the consensus among historians and anthropologists is that money developed as a social and governmental artifact, rather than as a mechanism for reducing transaction costs in private sector markets. Goodhart, 2009. Continuing. It is also consistent with the monetary theories of Karl Marx and, in modern times, Augusto Graziani, and the horizontalism of Nicholas Caldor, Basil Moore, and many others. Modern monetary theorists, like these economists, reject as being works of pure fiction both the orthodox money multiplier theory of fractional reserve banking and the orthodox loanable funds view of interest rates. Note 4. Graziani was the founder of modern monetary circuit theory and clarified its Marxist roots. It can be related back to the French economist Jacques Le Bourgeois, and even to Knut Wicksell, in the sense that it is an endogenous credit theory of money. Entz and Barbaro, 2017. There are similarities with the work of Hyman Minsky. Although the emphasis is on the private sector rather than on the state, it is completely consistent with modern monetary theory. Modern economists influenced by modern economists influenced by monetary theory include Marc Lavoie, Steve Keen, and a variety of others broadly sympathetic to modern monetary theory. According to Randall Wray, the name modern monetary theory itself is derived from these words in Keynes' A Treatise on Money. The state, therefore, comes in first of all as the state, therefore, comes in first of all as the authority of law which enforces the payment of the thing which corresponds to the name or description in the contracts. But it comes in doubly when, in addition, it claims the right to determine and declare what thing represents to the name and to vary its declaration from time to time, when, that is to say, it claims the right to re-edit the dictionary. This right is claimed by all modern states and has been so claimed for some 4,000 years at least. That was a big quote from A Treatise on Money. By this definition, money has been modern throughout monetary history. As for Keynes and the school of thought we now know as MMT, it would be wrong to say that modern monetary theory can be found fully developed in Keynes' works, although there are statements in both the treatise and the general theory which anticipate modern monetary theory. Moreover, in a letter to James Mead written in 1943, Keynes said of Abel Lerner, the father of functional finance, and so for some, if not the grandfather of modern monetary theory, at least a favored uncle, quote, his argument is impeccable, but heaven help anyone who tries to put it across. Modern monetary theory is an updated, fuller, and more sophisticated development out of Abel Lerner's laws of functional finance and Hyman Minsky's call for an effective instability thwarting mechanism based on fiscal policy. The difficulties of putting it across are no less severe today than they were in 1943, when that letter was written. If we are to have a second Keynesian revolution, which is more faithful to the economics of Keynes, as opposed to what became known as Keynesian economics, more resilient to attack and a basis for genuinely sustainable prosperity, they are difficulties which we must overcome. That's the end of the section. So we're on page 142. Next section is Axioms of Modern Monetary Theory. Next section, page 142, Axioms of Modern Monetary Theory. There are three core statements, or axioms, at the heart of modern monetary theory. Once learned, they can never be forgotten, and once understood, they are self-evident. Economic analysis which ignores them or which denies their validity is in defiance of either the laws of accounting or the laws of science, is incompetent and is therefore liable to be misleading. The first axiom is the statement that monetary sovereign governments face no purely financial budget constraints. This is widely misunderstood and is of vital importance. A monetary sovereign government is one with its own currency and central bank, a floating exchange rate, and no significant foreign currency denominated debt. The USA has a monetary sovereign government, and this monetary sovereignty is by no means dependent on the status of the dollar as a global reserve currency. Japan, Australia, and the UK are other examples of countries with monetary sovereign currency issuing governments. Monetary sovereignty, thus defined, is dependent on neither reserve currency status nor a country overall being a net international creditor. Australia and the modern-day UK fulfill neither of these criteria, and yet in both cases, these countries have monetary sovereign status. The Eurozone countries are not monetary sovereigns as they do not have their own currencies. Governments are not fully monetary sovereign if they are committed to the defense of a fixed exchange rate, whether that is against a single foreign currency, a basket of currencies, or a commodity. When the USA and the UK were on the gold standard, their governments were not monetary sovereigns. This limited the policy space available to such governments in managing their economies. It is the reason the gold standard broke down in the 1930s and the reason the Bretton Woods Agreement system failed. The reason the Bretton Woods system failed in the early 1970s. It is also the reason for the prolonged economic slump in so many Eurozone countries in the decades since the Great Recession. Even governments with their own currencies and no commitment to a fixed exchange rate are not fully sovereign if they have significant foreign currency denominated liabilities, or at least have limitations on their sovereignty if, like many low and middle income countries, they are currently dependent on imported necessities such as food and energy, priced in terms of foreign currency, and so are vulnerable to currency depreciation on the foreign exchange market. Modern monetary theorists normally advise central governments, which are not currently monetary sovereigns, to achieve or restore that sovereignty, or where that sovereignty is compromised, as described in the previous paragraph, to work to eliminate the causes of the limitations on their monetary sovereignty. In a low or middle income country, this might involve working towards self-sufficiency in sustainable agriculture and or green energy, supported by a job guarantee scheme as recommended by Fidel Kaboub and the other researchers at the Binzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. More generally, an acceptance of austerity, unemployment, and poverty due to a fear that a fiscal deficit might drive currency devaluation and imported cost push inflation is not the appropriate response. To those who argue modern monetary theory is inapplicable to low and middle income countries. What? I got to read the sentence again. More generally, an acceptance of austerity, unemployment, and poverty due to a fear that a fiscal deficit might drive currency devaluation and imported cost-push inflation is not the appropriate response to those who argue modern monetary theory is inapplicable to low and middle income countries. Instead, policymakers should identify whether such vulnerability is real or imagined, and to the extent it is real, work towards resolving the structural issues which are its cause. A trade deficit, which is simply a reflection of the rest of the world wishing to net export to a country, is not necessarily a threat. Indeed, it can be seen as a net benefit for the country, since the rest of the world is exchanging goods and services which are costly to produce for domestic currency, which has zero production cost, and are thereby adding to the well-being of domestic residents as long as full employment is maintained. Looked at this way, trade deficits benefit domestic residents while trade surpluses are costly as well as being unnecessary. Just as we cannot meaningfully classify any fiscal balance as good or bad out of context of the current state of the economy, the same is true of a current account or trade balance. Only monetary sovereigns are in a position to guarantee sustainable prosperity, where that prosperity is based on equitable full employment and not on private debt, or the pursuit of an unnecessary trade surplus. Only monetary sovereigns are free of purely financial constraints on their net spending. Only monetary sovereign governments are free of the need to, quote, get into debt, and in a position to ignore threats from credit rating agencies and the mistaken advice of those who believe financial markets can undermine their ability to maintain full employment. Monetary sovereign governments, such as the government of Japan, cannot ever run out of their own currencies. They cannot be forced into insolvency as a result of accumulating liabilities denominated in those currencies. The very notion is absurd. Note 8. As has been confirmed to be so by a long list of authorities, including on more than one occasion, Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1987 until 2006. Continuing. Among the insights to be derived from modern monetary theory is the fact that such governments do not necessarily need to issue debt securities at all. They may choose to do so if such securities play a useful role in their financial system. They may continue to do so, such as an anachronism, continuing with a practice which may have had value in the days of a gold standard, or at least of a fixed exchange rate which had to be defended using foreign currency reserves. They may have institutional arrangements which make it appear as though the government must borrow by issuing debt securities before it can net spend, even though this is misleading, and in any case, those institutional arrangements can easily be changed. They may use government security issuance to manage liquidity on the private money market for the management of interest rates, so that selling government bonds is an act of monetary policy rather than a fiscal policy. But they do not actually need to issue treasury bonds or bills at all. The second core statement or axiom of modern monetary theory is that all economies and all governments face real and ecological limits relating to what could be produced and consumed, depending on the current productive capacity of the economy. It is obvious that monetary sovereign governments can cause inflation, if they choose, by spending too much themselves or not taxing highly enough. When this happens, the total level of spending in the economy exceeds what can be produced by all the labor, skills, physical capital, technology, and natural resources which are available. Occasionally, even professional economists, when attempting to criticize modern monetary theory, confuse the first and second axioms and end up accusing modern monetary theorists of assuming that real resources are inexhaustible. We can obviously also damage and even potentially destroy our natural ecosystem if we produce too many of the wrong things, or use the wrong process to produce what we want to consume. Ecological sustainability is not an issue which can just be swept under the carpet, and I will return to this issue in chapters 7 and 8. Currency issuing governments do not need to tax us before they can spend. And once you understand the distinction between a currency issuer and the users of that currency, it becomes obvious that this is the wrong way to think about taxation. We need to obtain the government's money. They do not need to obtain ours. Why would they need their currency, which they create, from us? Until what we will describe below as the monetary base, which includes electronic reserves held by the banking system at the central bank, as well as physical currency, is spent into existence by the government. It cannot be used to pay taxes or accumulate in the private sector as a nominally safe financial asset. The spending comes before the taxation or the bond issuance. The macroeconomic purpose of taxation is to create space within the productive capacity of the economy to allow for government spending on public goods without total private and government spending being excessive. In other words, the reason we have to pay taxes is to limit inflation and to guarantee a sufficient demand for the government's money as, quote, that which is necessary to pay taxes to support its value. This does not mean government spending and taxation have to equal each other, and in countries like the USA, Japan, the UK, or Australia, this rarely happens in practice. Consider the fiscal balance of the USA since 1970, shown as a share of gross domestic product in figure 5.1. So I'm going to just show it to you. There's no point reading it or describing it. Can that be seen? Yes, it can. So just roughly. So dark is USA. Percent of GDP is that line, 0%. The unfortunate Clinton surplus, which helped to set up the conditions for a financial crisis, is clear enough, as is the normal requirement for the US government to run fiscal deficits. Japan's big financial crisis hit in the early 1990s. Once again, a fiscal surplus seems an unwise goal, and fiscal deficits normal and necessary. And for the UK, apart from the Margaret Thatcher surplus in the late 1980s, you cannot help but notice the similarity with the chart for the USA. Once again, fiscal surpluses have not been associated with sustainable prosperity, but have instead been combined with rising private debt, financial fragility, and eventual recession, or even major financial crisis. As we have already said, these countries have monetary sovereign governments, so that their governments are never obliged to run such surpluses. The modern monetary theory and stock flow consistent macroeconomics of this chapter and the next explain that any specific fiscal target taken out of context is a serious mistake, that the fiscal balance should move endogenously to meet the net savings desires of the non-government, domestic, private, and foreign sectors at full employment, and that it is normal and even good for the fiscal balance to be in deficit. It is a similar story for Australia. Once again, the fiscal surplus of the late 1980s occurred before a severe recession in the early 1990s. The surpluses of the late 1990s and the early 2000s, while they did not lead to a recession, could only be sustained by a buildup in private sector and most notably household debt. Australia consequently now has a household debt to GDP ratio far above that of the other countries, about double that of Japan, about 50% higher than that of the USA, and close to being the world's highest. The consequence is a more fragile financial system supported by an expensive property market, especially in the two major cities of Sydney and Melbourne. Whether there is a Minskian downturn in store for Australia, driven by a deflating property market, is something that only time can tell. Only a willingness to add sufficiently large discretionary element, only a willingness to add a sufficiently large discretionary element to what was an endogenously emergent fiscal deficit in 2009 prevented this from happening almost a decade ago. Balanced budget rules or arbitrary limits on fiscal deficits along the lines of the Eurozone Fiscal Stability Treaty are foolish and betray a tragic lack of understanding of the responsibilities and opportunities of a monetary sovereign government. This should be obvious to anyone familiar with Lerner's writing on functional finance in the 1940s, let alone the body of work contributed by modern monetary theorists since the 1990s. It leads us on nicely to the third core statement or axiom of modern monetary theory, which is that the government's financial deficits is everyone else's financial surplus. Since this principle is closely related to the stock flow consistent macroeconomics of Chapter 6, I will explain it only very briefly here. For every borrower in a financial system, there must be a lender. This means that financial surpluses, lending, and financial deficits, borrowing, always cancel out. Or if surpluses are recorded as plus items and deficits as negative items, they always sum to zero. At issue is which institution is best placed to issue the net financial liabilities that others can then hold as assets: the currency issuer, which cannot become insolvent, or currency users, for whom debt repayments are a burden which can lead to insolvency. The answer should be obvious. If governments want a secure financial system, they should want strong private sector balance sheets, which means the private sector will need to be able to net save, and so the monetary sovereign government will need to spend into existence the money to make saving possible. In an economy with a zero trade balance, if the government wants the private sector to net save over time and to develop more secure balance sheets, then the government will have to run a financial deficit. It will have to spend more currency into the private sector than it taxes out of it again, allowing the private sector to run a financial surplus. If the rest of the world wishes to accumulate net financial assets in the country, such as it wants to net export to the country, then the government's deficit will have to run a deficit large enough to meet both this desire and the wishes of the private sector to net save. The only way for the private sector and the government sector to both run surpluses at once is if the country as a whole is running a surplus on the current account of its balance of payments and lending to the rest of the world. While some countries like Norway, Singapore, or Germany can and do net export enough so that this is possible, it is obviously not possible for all countries to pursue this strategy at the same time with success. Even these countries can only do this to the extent that in other countries, governments are prepared to net spend and/or private sectors are prepared to accumulate further debt. The world as a whole cannot be a net exporter. In the great majority of countries, for the private sector to be in surplus, the government must be in deficit. We will return to this insight in the next chapter. It is vitally important. The fact that it is not generally understood, despite the fact that most governments nonetheless do run fiscal deficits most of the time, is a testament to the strength of grip which the misleading, quote, government as household metaphor has on economic discourse. That's the end of the section. So this is page 148. And then try one more time for water. I will be right back. Probably yes. All right, so there's about 20 minutes left. At this point, if there were a lot of people talking, I probably would stop and talk with you, but there's no reason not to just keep going right now. So this seems like I'm going to stop in the middle of a section, and that's fine. Actually, this is a short section. And then next week, I'm just going to continue right here, and we'll see where it goes. Excuse me. Page 148. Next section. Excuse me. ABBA Lerner's Laws of Functional Finance. The closest forerunner of modern monetary theory was, as I have stated, ABBA Lerner's theory of functional finance. Lerner's view was that the government's fiscal balance should be allowed to move to whatever level is required to maintain full employment, given the current spending and portfolio decisions of the private sector. The implication is that the fiscal balance is an endogenous variable, reacting to the inevitable cyclical swings in private sector behavior and alleviating the normal tendency of capitalist economies to generate insufficient effective demand for the achievement and maintenance of tight, full employment. Nobody but the government can take responsibility for maintaining the total level of spending in the economy at the full employment level. Lerner wrote that, quote, "The first financial responsibility of the government is to keep the total rate of spending in the country on goods and services neither greater nor less than that rate which at the current prices would buy all the goods that is possible to reproduce." This is in contrast with the sound finance of the pre-Keynesian Treasury view of the 1920s, which in its modern form still dominates policy thinking today on the verge of the 2020s. And he has a parenthesis with 2 exclamation marks to emphasize that. It is a very persistent, if innocent, fraud indeed, under a dovish modern interpretation of, quote, sound finance. A government may run a fiscal deficit during an economic recession, but ought to avoid fiscal deficits on average across the cycle, or at least to avoid structural deficits large enough to increase the ratio of government debt to GDP over time. The central bank should then set official interest rates to achieve an explicit or implicit inflation target, and should avoid purchasing significant levels of government debt in the primary market in order to avoid, quote, monetizing the government's deficit. To monetize the deficit is viewed as a, quote, unsound financial policy. Such was the policy consensus, at least among the great majority of orthodox neoclassical economists of the 1990s and 2000s. It probably still is. Implicit in sound finance is the view that monetizing government debt, since it adds to reserves of federal funds held in the banking system, is more inflationary than debt finance via sales of government bonds to the private sector. Such a view is based on a widely held misunderstanding of how modern banking systems work and a persistent confusion among economists and policymakers about how monetary policy works and about the impact it can have on credit creation, total spending, and inflation. Lerner got it right many years ago when he described the government bond issuance as essentially a swap of one government liability for another. Quote, "The second law of functional finance is that the government should borrow money only if it is desirable that the public should have less money and more government bonds, for these are the effects of government borrowing." He rejected the sound finance in his 2 laws of functional finance. Firstly, by explaining that arbitrary government deficit and debt ratios are not an appropriate focus of economic policy. And secondly, by demonstrating that deficits do not need to be fully funded through bond sales. Originally, Lerner was writing in an era where persistent inflation outside wartime was not anticipated. However, as inflationary pressures built up in the post-war period, partly for the sociological reasons identified by Hyman Minsky, he added a tax-based incomes policy as advocated by Stanley Weintraub to his proposals. Later, he shifted towards a market-based permit scheme to manage wage increases, reminiscent of the cap-and-trade approach for dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. The main inflation anchor in modern monetary theory is the wage paid to participants in the government's job guarantee scheme, but this does not exclude the possibility of other mechanisms being used where necessary to manage inflation. Lerner's views on government finance are shared by modern monetary theorists. Modern monetary theory includes much more than functional finance. However, as is demonstrated in this chapter, the importance of monetary sovereignty, the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy, the limitations of monetary policy, the operations of a modern financial system, stock flow consistency, the potential for Minsky financial instability, and the functions of a job guarantee are all essential parts of modern monetary theory. To recap, the first axiom of modern monetary theory is that a monetary sovereign government faces no purely financial constraint. The second axiom of modern monetary theory is that all governments, whether monetary sovereigns or not, face real and ecological constraints relating to the productive capacity of the economy. A lack of natural resources, human resources, capital resources, skills, and technology limits what can be produced. Limitations on the stock of non-renewable resources and on the assimilative capacity of the environment regarding waste generated in production or consumption limits what can be sustainably produced. Limits what can be sustainably produced. The second axiom does not invalidate the first one, however. What is possible, given our limited real and ecological resources, can always be paid for. Money is not the issue. All right, so it's 451. MMT Basics is the next section. So this is page 150. The next section is called MMT Basics. I guess I'll read this chapter. It's not that long. And then we're going to stop. And I will just continue next week and go on to chapter 7 and 8. And then we'll do other stuff. Page 150. Oops. Next section, MMT Basics. The simplest way to explain the essentials of modern monetary theory is within an apparently unrealistic institutional framework, with a consolidated government sector and no separate central bank, or where the central bank is just a government department. This conflation of the central bank with the central government is sometimes objected to by critics of the MMT because it is not consistent with current institutional arrangements. I accept that criticism, noting, however, firstly, that as Minsky said, institutional arrangements which are currently a barrier to the pursuit of public purpose can always be changed. And secondly, that the axioms of modern monetary policy still apply under more complicated institutional setups. To put it another way, such critics have missed the point. Note 9. This is among the criticisms of modern monetary theorists listed by Marc Lavoie in a broadly supportive paper in 2013. Continuing. If we, for the moment, defy the critics and consolidate the central bank into a government sector, then there is no distinction between the balance sheet of the central bank and the central government. The following points are then rendered very clear. Government expenditure involves the direct creation of bank deposits and bank reserves. Governments literally spend via keystrokes, and there are no financial limits on government spending beyond normal budgetary processes. Government spending is financed when it is authorized, purely by being authorized. Since there are no financial limits on government spending, the government does not need to tax or to generate other cash flows for itself before it can spend. It has, therefore, no fiscal motivation for issuing debt securities. Government bonds and bills are unnecessary, at least from the perspective of financing government spending. That was bullet 2, now bullet 3. Taxation exists not to finance government spending, but purely to modify private sector behavior and economic outcomes. Taxation is there primarily to limit private sector purchasing power by reducing disposable incomes, to create room within full employment output for non-inflationary government spending, and to create sufficient demands for government money to maintain its acceptability and price stability. In addition, the conventional microeconomic functions of discouraging undesirable activities and contributing towards a socially acceptable distribution of income and wealth remain valid. In this institutional setup, there is no distinction between sales of government securities by the central government, which are conventionally seen to have the role of funding the government deficit and avoiding its more inflationary monetization, and sales of securities by the central bank, which are concerned with the management of bank cash reserves and the maintenance of the official interest rate target. The former motivation for bond issues, as I have already stated, is not a valid one, which leaves us with bond issues being justifiable only for the purposes of interest rate maintenance on the overnight cash market. Sales of government securities in this institutional setup can only be justified for this purpose, which makes them monetary policy operations rather than fiscal ones, and as a means of providing a safe interest-bearing asset to fulfill the requirement for a nominally safe benchmark asset in private sector portfolios. Next bullet point. The overall size of the government relative to the private sector remains a political issue, depending on the preferences of the electorate for public goods as opposed to private goods, and on the level of taxation which is necessary to ensure that total government and private sector spending does not exceed what is consistent with non-inflationary full employment. The full balance is then free to move over this cycle in response to automatic stabilizers and discretionary policy changes. The balance is mainly determined endogenously by non-government sector spending and saving behavior, where the non-government sector includes both the domestic private sector and the rest of the world. That's the end of the final bullet. The absorption of the central bank into the government sector the absorption of the central bank into the government sector so that it is not treated as a separate institution purely facilitates clarity. The validity of modern monetary theory is not dependent on consolidating the central bank into the government in this way. The above claims remain true, in other words, even when the central bank exists as a separate institution from the central government, as long as the central bank is prepared to lend to the central government without limit, lend being in quotes. To purchase government bonds when required in the primary market, to provide the central government with an unrestricted overdraft facility, or just to purchase government bonds without limit in the secondary market, as the Bank of Japan has been doing in 2017 and 2018. Just a commitment by the central bank to never bounce a government check is more than enough. Central banks do not bounce government checks in monetary sovereign economies. Government net spending then generates an asset for the central bank in the form of government securities or a government overdraft to match the liability of increased commercial bank reserves and, of course, increased bank deposits for the private sector. There remains no financial limitation on government spending. Everything else remains as before, although it may appear to be the case that government spending is financed through taxation or bond sales, as they lead to credits on the government's balance at the central bank, which are, in an accounting sense, necessary to permit government spending from this balance. This is an illusion. To fall for such an illusion is to display a lack of understanding of the monetary system. It is an illusion because it is a misleading way of describing financial processes. In practice, the government can still spend without limit through the use of keystrokes and by any available for purchase in domestic currency. The existence of a separate institution called a central bank with its own balance sheet does not alter the fiscal space available to a monetary sovereign government. Fulwiler, 2010. It is, in effect, just a convention of public finance accounting. That such governments can, and generally do, act as though they need to raise taxes before they can pay for their spending, can be put down to ignorance or to politics. They may issue government securities, as Lerner suggested, because they think it is a worthwhile thing to do, given the role played by those securities as default risk-free financial assets for the private sector and across the financial system. They may do so, however, for purely anachronistic reasons, or out of ignorance, or possibly for political reasons once again. if current institutional arrangements which do not change the truth of the axioms of modern monetary theory obscure that truth and mislead policymakers, many economists, and the general public. Wait, let me say that again. If current institutional arrangements, which do not change the truth of the axioms of modern monetary theory, obscure the truth and mislead policymakers, many economists, and the general public, there is a good case for changing and simplifying those arrangements. Central banks are effectively just departments within the government. Even if important decisions made within them, for example on official interest rates, are made for good or ill, independently of elected politicians. Even if important decisions made within them, for good or ill, independently of elected politicians. Okay. All right, so that's all. So this is page 153. That's the end of the section. The next section is called Fiscal Sustainability. This goes up to 180 something. So I'm just going to continue here next week. I will write the page numbers so people can keep track. And what I want to do, I forgot what I was going to say. I want to read economic papers and books that are no longer copyrighted. So I can read them without a problem, without having to get permission. So suggestions from people out there of what are important. The next one I'm going to be doing after this is Stephanie Kelton, who was Stephanie Bell at the time, her 1998 paper saying that taxes do not fund federal spending, and that all federal spending has always been created currency. So thank you for being here. I am learning while you are learning, and I look forward to doing this, continuing this. So have a good night, everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye.